Edwin Price's boots hit Elowen Hartwell's porch boards before she'd even finished her morning coffee. He didn't knock. He walked straight through the unlocked door, the way men like him always did, as if every room they entered already belonged to them. "You're going to marry Harlan Voss by the end of the month," he said, dropping a thick folder of papers on her kitchen table. "Or I'll have this property seized for the debts your fool husband left behind. Every acre." "The spring, too." Elowen set her cup down very slowly. "Those debts don't exist, Edwin. They do now," he smiled. "And I have the paperwork to prove it." She looked at the papers. She looked at his face. And something cold and clear settled into the bottom of her stomach, not fear exactly, but the particular stillness that comes right before a woman decides she has nothing left to lose. If this kind of story reaches down into something real for you, the kind where ordinary people are pushed past what they think they can bear, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part of Elowen's story to the end. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. These stories have traveled further than we ever imagined, and we want to see just how far this one goes. Now, let's go back to where it really started. The town of Callaway Flats, Wyoming, had opinions about Elowen Hartwell the way it had opinions about most things loudly, confidently, and almost entirely wrong. The women at Decker's dry goods store said she was putting on airs, living alone out on that homestead like she had something to prove. The men at the feed yard said she'd run that place into the ground, inside of 2 years without a husband. The preacher's wife said the poor creature was simply too proud for her own good, and pride in a widow was a dangerous thing, like a fire in a dry barn. What none of them said, what none of them seemed able to see, was that Elowen Hartwell had been running that homestead alone for 14 months. Through a bad autumn, and a brutal winter, and a spring that came 3 weeks too late, and she had not lost a single acre. She had lost almost everything else. Her husband, Thomas, had died of a lung infection the previous November, leaving behind a homestead deed, a spring nobody had bothered to accurately survey, $31 in a tin box under the floorboards, and a cousin named Edwin Price who had driven 2 days from Cheyenne to attend the funeral with a suspiciously dry face and a folder of papers tucked under his arm. Edwin had not pushed anything on her that first day. He'd been warm, almost solicitous, pressing her hand at the graveside and telling her she only needed to say the word, and he would help settle Thomas's affairs. She had thanked him and shown him the door, and he had gone without argument, which she had found, even at the time, somewhat unsettling. The following March, she found out why. A letter had arrived from the Cheyenne Land Registry. Certain debts against the Hartwell estate, it said, were being reviewed for collection. She'd had a lawyer in Rawlins look at the letter. He'd frowned at it for a long time, then told her that the debts referenced in that notice didn't appear in any of Thomas's records he could locate. But that didn't mean they couldn't be manufactured to look real, if someone with enough money and patience wanted to do it. What would someone want badly enough to manufacture debts over? She'd asked. The lawyer had looked out his window toward the flat, distant line of the horizon. Something worth more than money, Mrs. Hartwell. Something that can't be bought outright. She'd driven home that evening with the particular kind of tired that lives behind the eyes, the kind that sleep doesn't touch. Silver Run Spring sat at the north corner of her property, fed by something underground that nobody fully understood, but that ran clean and cold and absolutely dependable through drought years, when every other water source in the Callaway Flats Basin went shallow or dry. In cattle country, water was not simply convenient. Water was everything. Water was power. Water was the difference between a rancher who survived a dry year and one who watched his herd die in August dust. Elowen had understood this dimly when Thomas was alive. She understood it in sharp and specific detail now that she was alone. It was a Tuesday in early April when the drifter appeared at her gate. She was pulling a fence post that had heaved loose during the freeze-thaw cycle, working a steel bar down beside it and leaning her whole body weight against the bar, when she heard the gate latch and looked up to find a man standing at the edge of her yard. He was tall, not unreasonably so, but tall enough that she noticed it first before she registered anything else. His boots were cracked at the toe seams. His coat was patched at both elbows with mismatched fabric, brown cloth over gray, the kind of repair that someone makes not because it looks good but because it has to hold. He had a horse with him, a plain sorrel that stood with its head low, looking like it had covered a lot of miles recently, and wasn't particularly excited about covering more. "I saw the fence line on my way in," the man said. He did not come any closer. He stood at the gate as if waiting to be invited or dismissed, which she found unusual in a stranger. Most men who showed up looking for work walked straight to the door as if the yard already belonged to them. "Looks like you've got about a quarter-mile of posts that need resetting." "I know what I've got," she said. "I wasn't saying you didn't." He had a direct way of speaking that she couldn't quite place. Not aggressive, just level. "I'm looking for work if you have it. I'll take wages and meals and a place to put my horse out of the weather. If you can't do cash, I won't cause trouble." She looked at him for a longer moment than was probably polite. His face was weathered in a way that didn't quite match his eyes. The eyes were clear and watchful and not especially tired, which didn't fit with the rest of him: the cracked boots, the patched coat, the horse that looked like it needed 2 weeks of good grass. "What's your name?" she said. "Cal Rourke." "Where are you coming from, Cal Rourke?" "East," he said. "Most recently." It was a non-answer, and they both knew it. She pulled the fence post out of the ground, dropped it beside the hole, and straightened up. Her lower back announced its displeasure, as it had been doing with increasing frequency since February. "I've got fence posts to reset and a barn roof that won't make it through another spring storm," she said. "I can give you 2 meals a day and a dry place in the barn. There's no money in it right now." "That's fine," he said. "You eat what I cook, and you don't complain about it." "Understood. And you stay away from the north corner of the property near the spring." "That's not a request." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, she thought, but a careful adjustment, the way a person's expression changes when they've heard something that matters, and they don't want it to show. "All right," he said. "Put your horse in the corral. There's a water trough by the gate. I'll have something on the stove by midday." She turned back to her fence post and didn't watch him go, which was a choice she was aware of making. Watching would have meant something. Not watching meant she was already back at work, which was simply where she lived. His name, for the record, was not Cal Rourke. His name was Harlan Voss, and he owned 40,000 acres of the best grazing land in 2 counties, a herd of nearly 3,000 cattle, and a reputation in Wyoming ranching circles as a man who did not make careless decisions. He had built his operation from his father's modest start through 15 years of ruthless attention to detail, careful expansion, and a talent for identifying what other men overlooked until it was too late. He had arrived at Elowen Hartwell's gate wearing borrowed clothes, and a story that wasn't entirely untrue. He had come from the East, most recently from Cheyenne, where he had spent 2 days reviewing the proposition that Edwin Price had laid before him. Edwin's plan was elegant in the cold-blooded way that Edwin's plans tended to be. Harlan needed reliable water access for the southern expansion of his herd. Silver Run Spring sat on property owned by a widow who was, according to Edwin, financially desperate and entirely open to a marriage that would solve her money problems. Edwin had certain leverage over the estate debts he described as technical obligations that can be presented or withheld depending on how the widow cooperates, and he was prepared to apply that leverage or dissolve it as needed to make the marriage happen. Harlan had listened to the whole thing without expression, which was something he'd spent years learning to do. "You want me to marry a woman you've been threatening," he'd said when Edwin finished. "I want you to marry a woman who will be grateful for rescue," Edwin had said pleasantly. "She doesn't need to know the details of how the situation was arranged." Harlan had said he needed time to think about it. What he had actually needed was to see the woman for himself, because the part of the plan that troubled him, the part that had kept him awake the night before, was not the ethics of Edwin's leverage, though that was bad enough. It was the description Edwin had given of Elowen Hartwell herself. A beautiful widow was how Edwin had put it. Clever enough to keep the homestead running, but fundamentally practical about her circumstances. Understands that a woman alone in Wyoming needs to make smart choices. She'll see the value in this arrangement once it's properly presented. That phrasing, "she'll see the value," had planted something uneasy in Harlan's chest. He'd heard men talk about women that way before, reducing them to problems that needed to be solved by marriage to the right man. He'd found it distasteful then, and he found it distasteful now, even coming from a man whose financial proposition was otherwise sound. So he had come to look. Not as Harlan Voss, because Harlan Voss at Elowen Hartwell's gate would have meant a formal visit, forced courtesy, everyone performing their best version of themselves. He had come as a poor man, wearing cracked boots and a patched coat borrowed from his ranch foreman, because a poor man got to see how a woman actually behaved when there was nothing to be gained by impressing him. He had expected to find someone desperate, someone who would ask him, within the first hour, if he knew anyone with money. He had found her pulling fence posts by herself in the April mud, and she hadn't asked him a single thing about who he knew. The first week was an education in several things simultaneously. Elowen cooked plain food, and a lot of it beans, cornbread, salt pork when she had it, dried apple when she didn't. She ate what she served, which was the first thing Harlan noticed, because he'd known women who served the best portions to their guests and ate the leavings themselves, and he'd always found it sad in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Elowen put the same amount on every plate and sat down at the table like the meal was a practical necessity rather than a social performance. She gave him his instructions every morning the way a foreman gives instructions, specific, direct, no extra words. The south pasture fence needed 8 new posts. The barn roof had 3 sections of bad shingles. She would show him which ones. The water trough near the corral had developed a slow leak she hadn't had time to address. She pointed at each problem in turn and expected him to solve it. She did not watch over his shoulder to see if he was doing it right. That surprised him. He'd expected someone managing a homestead alone to be vigilant, controlling, anxious about every decision. Instead, once she gave him a task, she went back to her own work with a completeness that suggested she'd already decided whether he was trustworthy and wasn't going to revisit the question every 20 minutes. He was repairing the water trough on the 3rd day, when her dog, a large, indifferent cattle dog named Porter, came and sat directly on his boot and refused to move. Harlan looked at the dog. The dog looked at nothing in particular. "Porter doesn't usually do that," Elowen said from the fence rail, where she was splicing wire. She didn't look up from the wire. "He ignored my brother-in-law for 3 years. Should I be flattered or suspicious?" Harlan said. "Probably both," she said. "He's a decent judge of character, but he's also bribed fairly easily if you fed him this morning." "I didn't feed him." She glanced up briefly, then maybe just flattered. It was a small exchange, the kind that gets forgotten in a day. But Harlan found himself turning it over later in the evening, sitting outside the barn with his back against the boards, listening to the specific quiet of a Wyoming night. There was something in the way she'd said it, not coy, not performing friendliness, just a real observation delivered in a real voice that was different from most conversations he had. Most conversations Harlan had, people were trying to get something: information, money, reassurance, advantage. They shaped what they said around what they needed from him. Elowen seemed constitutionally incapable of doing this, possibly because she wasn't paying enough attention to him to bother. On the 5th day, a rider came from town. Harlan was on the barn roof when he heard the horse, and he stayed where he was partly because coming down from a roof takes time, and partly because he'd learned that people sometimes spoke more freely when they forgot there was someone above them. The rider was a young man from the feed store, delivering a message. Harlan couldn't hear all of it from the roof, but he caught the relevant pieces: a name, price, and a date, and something about papers that needed to be signed before the end of the month. He watched Elowen's back while she listened. She stood very still, which he was learning was what she did, instead of reacting visibly. When the rider finished, she said something short, and the rider went away. Then she stood in the yard for a moment with her hands at her sides, looking at nothing in particular. "Problem?" Harlan called down. She looked up, apparently having forgotten he was there. "Nothing that wasn't already a problem," she said. She went back inside. He went back to the roof, but the name Price sat in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed by accident. Edwin Price, who was, at this moment, supposedly managing certain legal pressures on Elowen's behalf or against her behalf, depending on how you interpreted the arrangement. Harlan had told Edwin he was still considering the proposition. He had not told Edwin where he was going when he left Cheyenne. He spent a long time on that roof, driving nails into shingles with more force than was strictly necessary. On the 6th day, Elowen's neighbor came to the door. Her name was Mrs. Fitch, a red-faced, wide woman in her 50s, who had apparently been delivering opinions to the surrounding homesteads for 30 years and saw no reason to stop. Harlan was splitting wood in the side yard, close enough to hear everything through the open kitchen window without making any effort to do so. "You know what they're saying in town," Mrs. Fitch said. She had the particular way of starting conversations that assumed you already knew and just needed to be reminded. "I expect I can guess," Elowen said. There was the sound of a pot being moved on the stove. They're saying you've got a man living on your property, a drifter, and that you're planning to use him to make Harlan Voss jealous. A pause. That's remarkably creative, Elowen said. I'm having trouble finding the part that makes any sense. Well, they're also saying you agreed to marry Voss because you need his money. That you've been angling for a rich husband since before Thomas was cold. The pot sound stopped. Harlan set down his splitting maul very quietly. Mrs. Fitch, Elowen said, in a voice he hadn't heard her use before, not angry exactly, but with a kind of precise coldness to it, like a blade that had been properly sharpened. I have not agreed to marry anyone. I have not been angling for anything. And I would strongly suggest that the next time someone in Callaway Flats wants to speculate about my intentions, they come here and look at what I actually spend my days doing, rather than making up stories at the feed store. I'm just telling you what's being said. I appreciate that. Good afternoon. She didn't slam the door, which somehow made it worse. She closed it with a calm, definitive click that said everything the slam would have without the satisfaction. Harlan picked up the maul and split 3 more pieces of wood before he trusted himself to have a neutral expression. He hadn't been in this woman's yard a full week, and he already felt like the worst kind of idiot. On the 7th day, Edwin Price arrived. Harlan had been in the far pasture resetting fence posts and didn't see the buggy come up the road until it was already in the yard. He recognized it immediately, the matched bay horses, the lacquered sides, the particular self-importance of a vehicle chosen to impress people who couldn't afford one. He moved toward the fence line nearer the yard without quite running, which he achieved by walking very fast. By the time he could hear voices, Edwin was already inside. He stood outside the kitchen window, which was open 2 inches, and he listened. The notice from the registry is real, Elowen. Edwin's voice had that particular quality of warmth that meant nothing. Like sunlight through a window, it looked friendly from the outside, but couldn't actually heat anything. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to help you understand your situation before it becomes worse. And my situation is, Thomas borrowed against this property before he died. The notes are held by a third party now. If they call the notes, you lose everything. The house, the land, the spring. Silence for a moment. Show me the paperwork, Elowen said. Papers rustling. Harlan pressed himself against the siding and made himself breathe at a normal rate. These are the originals, Edwin said. Thomas never mentioned any of this to me. Men don't always trouble their wives with financial details. Thomas troubled me with every financial detail, because I was the one managing our accounts. Her voice was quiet. Every purchase, every debt, every dollar we owed and to whom. I have ledgers going back to the day we got here. Thomas's handwriting on every page. Another silence, and this one had a different quality. The ledgers don't change what the registry shows, Edwin said. If those debts are real, I'll find them in the ledgers. If they're not in the ledgers, they're not real. She stopped. And I think you know that, Edwin. Which means you're here because the debts are something you made. And you made them because you need me to do something I wouldn't do otherwise. The silence this time lasted long enough that Harlan started to wonder if someone was going to do something that required him to come through the window. Harlan Voss is a good man, Edwin said finally. The marriage would save you. I don't need saving. Elowen, get out of my house, Edwin. You're making a serious mistake. I'm showing you the door. I'll only do it once. Another pause, then footsteps toward the door. Harlan moved quickly around the corner of the house and was back at the woodpile with the maul in his hands before Edwin came off the porch. Edwin stopped when he saw him. He looked at Harlan for a moment, this patched, work-ruthened man with cracked boots, and something moved through Edwin's face that Harlan had seen before. The reflexive dismissal of someone who only valued what they could price. Who are you? Edwin said. Hired hand, Harlan said. He drove the maul into a log. The wood split with a crack that seemed to satisfy something. Edwin looked at him for another second, apparently decided there was nothing here worth examining, and climbed back into his buggy. Harlan watched the lacquered sides until they were past the gate. Then he looked at the logs and the maul and the yard around him, and he stood there for a while doing nothing at all. He had helped arrange this, not the specific details, but the overall shape. He had agreed to consider a marriage that Edwin was supposed to make happen through pressure. He had told himself he was coming here to verify the woman's character before making a decision. He had not thought carefully enough about what Edwin was doing to make the decision available for him to make. The wood blurred slightly, and he blinked it back into focus. When Elowen came out of the house an hour later, She didn't mention what had happened inside it. She told him supper would be ready at 6, and that the north pasture gate needed a new hinge tomorrow if he had time. He said he'd have time. On the 8th day, he found the survey document. He hadn't been looking for it. He had been in the barn rigging a pulley block for the hay mow when he knocked a tin box off a high shelf, and the box opened when it hit the ground and scattered its contents, several folded papers, a handful of surveyor's markings, and a letter in handwriting he recognized as older than Elowen's. He shouldn't have looked. He looked. The papers were a survey filing, old but clearly official, with a county seal from 1874. They described the course of Silver Run Spring in specific geological terms: the limestone shelf, the underground origin, the precise coordinates of the source. And the source, according to these papers, was located 12 feet inside the boundary of the Hartwell homestead patent, which meant that anyone claiming water rights to Silver Run through access arrangements or easements was claiming something they didn't own. The spring didn't rise on common land or county land. It rose on Elowen's land. It had always risen on Elowen's land. He put the papers back in the box and set the box on the shelf and stood in the barn for a long time, listening to the horses shifting in their stalls. Edwin had been promising Harlan water rights to Silver Run as part of the marriage arrangement. Edwin had known, or should have known, that those rights were already fully owned by the woman. Edwin was pressuring to accept the marriage. The whole thing was a fraud. Edwin was offering to sell Harlan something that wasn't Edwin's to sell, using legal threats he'd manufactured himself, pushing a widow into a marriage that would give her false security while giving the wrong people control of her most valuable asset. And Harlan had been sitting across from Edwin in Cheyenne, listening, nodding, saying he'd think about it. He came into supper that night and ate his beans and cornbread and said very little, which Elowen apparently found unremarkable because she said very little herself. After supper, she sat by the lamp with a ledger open in her lap, and he sat near the door with his hat in his hands and looked at the floor. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked up. "This spring you've got, the Silver Run, how long has the water been on this land?" She was quiet for a moment. "Since before Thomas filed the patent," she said carefully. "It's why we picked this piece." "Did your husband ever file any survey documentation on the source, where the water actually comes from?" Her expression shifted in a way he couldn't fully read. Cautious, he thought, and calculating in the way that intelligent people calculate when they aren't sure how much to say. "Why are you asking me that?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because I found a tin box in the barn when I knocked it off a shelf. I looked at the papers in it before I knew what they were. I put them back." The silence between them had a different quality now. She was very still, looking at him, doing whatever it was she did when she was deciding how much a person was worth trusting. "Yes," she said finally. "There's a survey filing. Thomas did it before he got sick. He said he wanted it on record, so nobody could ever claim the water came from somewhere else. Has anyone official seen that filing? Thomas sent a copy to the county registry. Whether it's still there, I don't know." Harlan nodded slowly and looked back at the floor. "It should be verified," he said. "If that document says what I think it says, it changes things." "It changes things how?" she said. Her voice was careful and direct and allowed for no evasion. He looked up. "It means nobody can take this land from you, not through debt arrangements or marriage schemes or anything else. The water source is yours, has always been yours. Anyone claiming rights to it was lying about what they had to offer." She looked at him for a long time. "That's a specific thing for a drifter to know," she said. "I read the survey document," he said. "It's pretty clear." She held his gaze, and he held hers, and neither of them said anything about all the things that were sitting in the room between them, which was quite a lot. "Good night, Cal," she said finally. "Good night," he said. He went out to the barn and lay on his bedroll in the dark, and stared at the boards above him and thought about Edwin Price, and the tin box on the high shelf, and the specific look on Elowen Hartwell's face when she decided whether she was going to trust you. And he thought, for the first time in a long time, that he was not sure he deserved what that look might give him, if it ever came. On the 9th day, the thing happened that made everything else collapse. He'd been driving Elowen's wagon to the Fitch property to return a borrowed tool, a simple errand she'd asked him to run, while she tended to a ewe that had gotten her leg tangled in wire. He'd passed the Fitch cabin, left the tool, and was coming back along the creek road when he heard her voice. She was around a bend of cottonwoods, not visible from the road, talking to someone he couldn't see. He pulled the horses up without thinking about whether he should, which later he would identify as the moment his intentions stopped mattering and the consequences started. "I understand what you're telling me," Elowen was saying. Her voice was even and factual, and had in it the particular quality of a woman who has been asked to be afraid and has simply decided not to. "But you should understand something back. I'm not going to marry Harlan Voss." A man's voice, not a voice he recognized, said something low and urgent. "Not for money," Elowen said, "not to keep the land. Not because Edwin Price has manufactured a reason. If I lose this homestead, I lose it. I'd rather that than become property that gets transferred through a marriage nobody asked me to agree to." The man said something else. Harlan thought he heard the word unfortunate. "Unfortunate isn't my concern," she said. "My concern is whether I can stand behind my own decisions in 10 years. And I cannot stand behind this one." A longer pause. "There's a man staying in my barn right now," she said. "A drifter who came looking for work. He has nothing. He'll probably move on in a week. And I trust him more than I trust Harlan Voss or Edwin Price or anyone else who's shown up in the last 6 months claiming to want what's best for me." Her voice was quiet and completely certain. "At least he doesn't want anything from me." The leaves of the cottonwoods moved in the April wind. Harlan sat on the wagon bench with the reins in his hands and felt something happen in his chest that was not comfortable and not brief and was not going to resolve itself by the time he got back to the homestead. She trusted the drifter in her barn. She trusted him more than Harlan Voss. And she was right to. And she was also completely wrong. And both of those things were true simultaneously in the way that the worst truths tend to be. He drove the wagon back to the yard and unhitched the horses and put them in the corral. He pumped water into the trough and stood there while they drank, watching them drink, not thinking about anything in particular, and thinking about everything all at once. A man could spend 15 years learning to see what other people overlooked. He could build 40,000 acres of operation on that particular skill. He could believe, genuinely believe, that seeing clearly was a virtue rather than an advantage. And he could show up in a stranger's yard in borrowed boots and spend 9 days watching a woman work herself to exhaustion caring for people who mostly didn't deserve it. And only then, only when he heard her say it out loud in a grove of cottonwoods, understand that he'd been testing the wrong person the entire time. She had passed whatever test he'd designed before he'd finished designing it, and he had failed hers without knowing she was running one. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on the bedroll in the barn with his hands behind his head and stared at the dark above him and listened to the horses breathe and thought about what it meant to be a man who had spent 9 days being someone else entirely while the woman, 20 yards away, went about her life trusting him with the version she believed was real. The sorrel shifted in its stall. Porter, the cattle dog, had taken up a position near the barn door and was doing what he always did at night, which was sleep in short intervals, and wake up to check that the world hadn't changed, then sleep again. Harlan watched the dog's ear twitch in the dark and thought that Porter probably had a cleaner conscience than either of the humans on this property. He had made a decision somewhere between the cottonwood grove and the water trough, though he couldn't have said exactly when. He knew what he needed to do about Edwin Price. He knew what he needed to do about the survey document. What he didn't know, what kept him awake past midnight and into the thin gray hours before dawn, was what he needed to do about the woman herself, and in what order any of it should happen, and whether any order was actually going to matter once she understood who he was. He was still awake when the roosters started. Elowen came out of the house at first light the way she always did, which was to say without ceremony or announcement, moving from the door to the water pump to the woodpile with the efficient unhurriedness, come-sixness of someone who has done the same things in the same order for long enough that the body does them without consulting the mind. She had a shawl over her shoulders, and her hair was still coming loose from last night's braid, which she fixed as she walked, pinning it back without breaking stride. Harlan was already at the woodpile. She stopped when she saw him, just for a second. Then she kept walking. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," he said. She looked at him, doing that thing she did where she read a person's face without appearing to. "Something bothering you?" A fair number of things were bothering him, he thought. "Just a lot of wood to split," he said. She accepted this without comment, which either meant she believed it or she'd decided not to push on it, and with Elowen, he'd learned, both were possible. She went to the pump, filled 2 buckets, and carried them toward the animal pens with a steadiness that made him feel obscurely ashamed of himself, for reasons he couldn't have explained to her. He split wood until his shoulders told him to stop. 3 days passed in the same pattern they'd established, which was work from dawn until the light failed, eats supper without much conversation, and sleep. It had a clean logic to it that Harlan found, underneath the guilt and the complicated situation, genuinely restful. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spent a week where the problems in front of him were concrete. This post needs to be set. This roof needs this shingle, instead of the layered, abstract problems of money and land, and people wanting things from him at angles he had to triangulate before he could respond. On the 3rd day after the Cottonwood incident, as he'd started privately calling it, a rider came from the western edge of the valley with news that changed the texture of everything. The fever had started at the Holt family's cabin. 2 children, both under 10, both down hard. The mother was sick too. The father had ridden to town and found nobody there who knew what to do about it, and the doctor who sometimes came through Callaway Flats from Rawlins wasn't due for another 2 weeks. The rider stopped at Elowen's gate and said all of this in a breathless run of sentences, holding his hat in both hands. He was maybe 17, clearly frightened, and had the look of someone who had ridden harder than he was used to. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, Mrs. Holt's sister told me you'd helped with the Carey baby last winter. She said you'd know what to do. Elowen had been listening from the porch steps. Her face did that still thing. Then she said, "Give me 10 minutes to get what I need," and went inside. Harlan looked at the boy. How bad are the children? Bad enough that Mr. Holt was crying. When he came to town, the boy said, and I've never seen Mr. Holt cry. What followed was not something Harlan had expected. He had anticipated, in a vague way, that Elowen might know some basic frontier medicine poultices, teas, the kind of practical knowledge that women in isolated areas accumulated from necessity. What he had not anticipated was the methodical efficiency with which she packed her kit, the specific herbs in specific quantities, the clean cloth, the particular bottles she chose and the ones she rejected, the way she moved through her own kitchen, like she had a map in her head of everything in it and exactly what it was for. He hitched her wagon without being asked. She came out with 2 cloth bags and a wooden box and put them in the wagon herself, then climbed up to the seat. She looked at him standing by the wheel. "You don't have to come," she said. "I know," he said, and climbed up on the other side. She drove, which he'd noticed she always did when they took the wagon, not as a statement, but simply because it was her wagon, and she knew the roads. He sat beside her and watched the valley open up around them. In the early morning, the grass still pale from the cold months, the sky doing that specific Wyoming thing, where it went all the way to the bottom of the horizon, without anything interrupting it. "Is this a fever you've seen before?" he asked. "Possibly. Maybe. I won't know until I see the children." She kept her eyes on the road. There was something similar in the valley 3 years ago. It moved fast through families with young children. "We lost the youngest Merritt boy." She paused. "I don't plan to lose the Holt children." He noticed the phrasing, not he hoped, not she'd try. She didn't plan to. "What do you need me to do when we get there?" he said. She glanced at him briefly. "Keep the father out of the room and the older Holt boy occupied. People in that situation, they stand too close and breathe too fast and ask questions every 30 seconds, and it makes everything harder." "I can manage that," he said. "I know you can," she said, which was not something he'd expected her to say, and which he turned over in his mind for the next quarter mile without arriving anywhere useful. The Holt cabin was a hard 2-hour drive from Elowen's homestead, past 3 dry creek beds and along a ridge road that the spring thaw had turned into a persuasive argument against wagon travel. Harlan spent a significant portion of the trip with one hand on the seatboard and the other ready to grab the brake, watching Elowen handle the horses across ground that had no business being driven on with any confidence. She drove it like she'd driven worse. Martin Holt came out of the cabin when he heard the wagon. He was a big man, raw-boned and weathered, the kind who looked like nothing short of an act of physical force would shake him. He had red eyes and hands that didn't know what to do with themselves, reaching up to the wagon before it stopped and reaching back and forward again in the helpless way of someone who needs to do something and has nothing to do. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "I'm sorry to I didn't know who else." "Stop apologizing, Martin, and tell me the symptoms," Elowen said, climbing down. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which Harlan noticed, because most people interrupted. She let Martin say everything he'd been holding in his chest since the children got sick, the full terrible inventory of it, before she asked a single question. Then she asked 3 very specific questions about the fever's progression, noted the answers with a brief nod, and went inside. Harlan stayed in the yard with Martin Holt and did exactly what she'd said. He asked about the cattle. He asked about the winter's damage to the east fence. He asked whether the creek on the south end had come up during the thaw. None of these things were remotely as important as what was happening inside the cabin, and both men knew it. But Martin Holt had somewhere to put his hands while he talked, and his breathing gradually stopped, sounding like a man drowning in air, which was the point. The older Holt boy, who was 13 and furious with helplessness, Harlan put to work hauling water to the trough. Physical tasks were their own kind of mercy. Elowen was inside the cabin for 4 hours. She came out once briefly to ask Harlan to bring in the wooden box from the wagon, and when he handed it to her through the door, she took it without ceremony and closed the door again. He went back to the yard. Martin had run out of things to say about the fence line by now and was sitting on a stump with his hands between his knees. The older boy had filled the trough twice and was looking for something else to demolish productively. "She's good," Martin said, not quite a question. "Yes," Harlan said. "How would you know? You've only been with her a couple weeks." "I've watched her work," Harlan said. "People who are good at things look a particular way when they're doing them." Martin was quiet for a minute. "My wife's sister said Elowen Hartwell was a cold woman. Hard to know, kept to herself too much." Harlan said nothing. "Doesn't seem like that to me," Martin said. "No," Harlan said. "It doesn't." When Elowen came out the second time, it was late afternoon, and her face was tired in a specific way, the kind of tired that comes from concentration rather than physical work. Though there had been physical work too, he could tell. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and she had a smear of something on her left wrist that she didn't appear to notice. "They'll be all right," she said. Martin Holt made a sound that was not quite a word. "The fever's going to peak tonight, and it'll be rough," she said. "But I've seen this specific progression before. If it follows the same course, they'll start to come down tomorrow. I left instructions with your wife." She stopped and seemed to remember something. "Your wife is also running a fever. Did you know that?" Martin stared at her. "She didn't tell me. She didn't want to worry you while you were worried about the children." "That's a very," Elowen paused. "It's a very her thing to do. She'll need the same treatment. I'll write it all down." She sat on the porch step and took out a small notebook and wrote carefully, and at length while Martin stood over her shoulder, reading each word as she wrote it, which she tolerated without comment. Harlan watched her hand move across the paper, the letters small and precise, and thought about the ledgers she'd mentioned Thomas's debts recorded in her handwriting because she'd been the one managing their accounts from the beginning. A woman who wrote things down, who kept records, who knew exactly what was owed and to whom, who had looked at Edwin Price's manufactured documents and known immediately that they were manufactured because she had the real ones in her own ledgers. Edwin was not nearly as clever as he believed himself to be. The problem was that clever didn't matter when you had enough legal machinery available to make real things look false and false things look real, and that machinery cost money, and Elowen didn't have money. Harlan did. That was a fact he had not yet figured out what to do with. They stopped at 2 more homesteads on the way back. He found this out when Elowen turned the wagon north at the fork instead of south, and he said, "The homestead is south," and she said, "I know where it is," and turned north. "There are 2 families up here who would have heard about the Holt children by now," she said. "I want to check on them before it spreads if it's going to." "Do they know you're coming?" "No." "Will they welcome it?" She glanced at him sideways. "Probably not. The Garveys don't particularly like me, and the Osborns and I have had words about their cattle grazing my fence line." She turned her attention back to the road. "That doesn't really change whether their children should be checked on." He had nothing to say to that. He sat with it while she drove, and it sat in him in the same way the earlier thing in the Cottonwood Grove had sat, not comfortably, but truthfully, in the way that real things occupy you without asking permission. The Garveys were, as advertised, not particularly welcoming. Mrs. Garvey opened the door approximately 4 inches and looked at Elowen with the particular expression of someone who has been storing an unflattering opinion for some time and isn't sure this occasion warrants dispensing with it. "We're fine here," Mrs. Garvey said. "I'm glad to hear it," Elowen said, with a pleasantness that wasn't quite warmth. "The Holt children are sick, fever. I'm checking nearby families as a precaution." Any symptoms in your household? A beat. Mrs. Garvey's expression did something complicated, like a door trying to decide whether to open. Gerald had a headache yesterday. How old is Gerald? 7. Could I see him? I won't touch anything I don't need to. Another beat. Longer. Then the door opened. Harlan stayed on the porch. Through the wall, he could hear Elowen's voice, low and even, and Gerald's higher one, and Mrs. Garvey's tight, reluctant responses gradually loosening as the conversation went on. When Elowen came out 12 minutes later, Mrs. Garvey was holding the door open, and her expression had moved from stored hostility to something more like uneasy gratitude, which was clearly costing her something. "Thank you," Mrs. Garvey said, as if she'd borrowed the words and wasn't sure she was using them right. "Gerald's fine," Elowen said. "Keep him warm tonight. If the headache comes back with a fever, send someone to my place immediately." She climbed back on the wagon without ceremony, and they drove on. "She doesn't like you," Harlan said. "No," Elowen agreed. "You helped her anyway." "Gerald is 7. She said it the way she might point out that the sky was a particular color. Factual, and not requiring elaboration. He looked at the road ahead of them and thought about his foreman back at the home ranch. A good man named Sutherland, who had once told him that the difference between a man of character and a man of reputation was what he did when there was nothing to gain. Harlan had thought he understood what that meant at the time. He was not sure he'd understood it as specifically as he did right now, watching a woman drive a wagon toward the homestead of people who'd had words with her about fence lines, because their children might need checking on. They reached the Osbornes as the sun started its final descent. The reception here was different. Nora Osborne, who was maybe 40, and had the look of someone who had been managing 3 children and an absent-minded husband since approximately forever, opened the door, looked at Elowen, looked at Harlan, and then looked back at Elowen. "I heard you were up at the Holt's," Nora said. "You heard that fast," Elowen said. "Remy Fitch passed by an hour ago. Is it bad?" "The children should recover." "I wanted to check your 3. Nora stepped back from the door immediately. "Come in, please." This was different from Mrs. Garvey in ways both practical and strange. Nora Osborne already had water heating and a lamp on the table, as if she'd been expecting someone capable and had been waiting. She hovered while Elowen looked at each child, but hovered in a useful direction, handing things before being asked and keeping the youngest occupied in the corner. When Elowen was done, Nora walked them to the wagon and stood with her arms folded against the evening cold. "I owe you an apology," Nora said. She said it straight out without working up to it. "About the fence line business. Tom should have fixed those cattle 6 months before he finally did," I told him. "He didn't listen and your fence paid for it." She looked directly at Elowen. "I'm sorry about that." Elowen looked at her for a moment. "The fence is fixed now," she said. "Still." "It's done," Elowen said, which Harlan was beginning to understand was how she accepted apologies briefly, without theater, closed and moved on. "Make sure they drink enough water tonight. All 3. They drove the last stretch home in the dark, which was slower going, but not as difficult as it might have been, because the temperature had dropped enough to firm up the thaw mud, and the horses knew the road by now. Elowen drove with the reins loose in her hands, leaning back slightly, her eyes forward. "You're exhausted," Harlan said. "I'm fine. Your hands have been shaking since we left the Osbornes." She looked at her hands, which were in fact doing a minor but visible tremor. She seemed surprised, as if her own body had provided a footnote she hadn't approved. "I get that when I've been concentrating too long," she said. "It stops. Is there anything you need me to do when we get back?" She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. "Feed the animals and check the water trough. I'll manage the rest." "I can manage the rest too," he said. She glanced at him. Then she looked at the road again. "All right," she said. "I won't argue." Which, from Elowen Hartwell, he was discovering, was a significant concession. They got back to the homestead after 8 o'clock. Harlan did the animals while Elowen went inside. And when he came in from the barn, she had managed to put a kettle on and sit down at the table before apparently losing the ability to do anything further, which he could tell from the way she was sitting straight-backed, but with her palms flat on the table in front of her, in the posture of someone maintaining upright only through commitment. He put together a meal out of what was available, which was not extensive, and set it in front of her without comment. She ate most of it before he'd finished his own, which suggested that whatever she'd been running on since morning had finally run out. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "The Holtz?" "Any of it, today." She moved her fork to the edge of her plate. I didn't ask you to come. I know. Most men who come looking for work think it means ranch work. Fences, roofs, hay. Not driving a widow around to homesteads where people don't want her. Most men who come looking for work haven't eaten your cornbread, he said. She looked at him. He watched her decide whether that was a joke. Then something in her face moved and she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but occupied the same space one would have. That's the strangest compliment my cooking has ever received, she said. I stand behind it, he said. She looked at her plate for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, the performance, what little of it she used, gone out of it. I heard back from a lawyer about those documents Edwin brought. The ones supposedly recording Thomas's debts. She paused. He thinks they were created recently. The paper composition is wrong for the date they're supposed to carry. Harlan was still. He can't prove it without more documentation, she said. But he doesn't think the debts are real, which I already knew. I just needed someone with legal standing to agree. What happens now, he said. I don't know yet. That depends on whether Edwin decides to push further or back down. She straightened slightly. I'm not going to back down. No, he said. I know you're not. She looked at him, and there was the reading face again, the one where she measured something. You know that from 2 weeks, she said. 10 days, he said. And yes, something passed between them that was not nothing, and both of them seemed to notice. And neither of them named it, which was probably the only sensible option given everything he hadn't told her yet. She cleared the plates, and he carried them to the wash bucket, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen with the particular careful awareness of people who are trying not to notice how close the other person is. Get some sleep, she said finally, drying the last plate. The south fence still needs 4 posts tomorrow. I'll get them before breakfast, he said. He went to the barn. Porter followed him and took up his position by the door and settled into the first of his short, vigilant sleeps. Harlan lay on his bedroll with one arm across his eyes. He had 3 clear problems arranged by urgency. The first was Edwin Price, who was not going to stop. Edwin had too much money already committed to this scheme to simply step back when a widow refused to cooperate. He would escalate. He would find a legal mechanism, real or constructed, and he would push until something broke. The second was the survey document, which Elowen knew existed, but hadn't shown anyone official yet, possibly because she didn't know whether it would hold up against whatever manufactured paperwork Edwin could produce in opposition. And the third was the matter of who Harlan Voss was and when Elowen Hartwell was going to find out. He couldn't address the third until he'd fixed the first 2. And fixing the first 2 meant doing something he hadn't done since he was 20 years old, and had far less to lose, something reckless and unilateral and dependent entirely on his own judgment without consulting anyone he trusted. He was going to have to ride to the county seat, not as Cal Rourke, as himself. He spent another hour thinking through what that meant, step by step, like walking a route he hadn't traveled before but needed to trust was solid. The law on water rights was specific. The survey document, if valid and properly recorded, established Elowen's ownership in terms nobody could dispute without committing outright fraud in front of a county registrar. Edwin's manufactured debts, if challenged by a man with enough resources to hire proper legal representation, would dissolve. Edwin's leverage would dissolve with them. Harlan had those resources. He had always had them. He'd just spent 10 days pretending he didn't. The thing that sat underneath all of it, that he couldn't logic around no matter how many times he tried, was that once he rode into that county seat and filed those documents as Harlan Voss, the disguise was over. Everything came out. And Elowen Hartwell, who had made an absolutely correct judgment about a man she trusted, and an absolutely correct judgment about a man she didn't, was going to find out that the one she trusted had been lying to her face every single day for 10 days. He did not think she was the kind of person who would take that quietly. He did not think she should be. Porter's ear twitched in the dark. One of the horses exhaled slowly, a long, patient sound. Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what it always did, which was to go absolutely still and let the stars make whatever argument they were going to make about the size of everything. Harlan lay in the dark and thought about 10 days' worth of cornbread and fence posts, and a woman driving a wagon to homesteads where people didn't want her. And he thought about the survey document in the tin box on the high shelf, and he thought about Edwin Price's manufactured papers and the specific shape of the mistake he had very nearly finished making. Then he stopped thinking about all of it and made his decision in the clean, simple way decisions finally get made when you've run out of ways to avoid them. He would ride out before dawn. He would fix what could be fixed. And then he would come back and stand in front of Elowen Hartwell and say his actual name and let whatever happened next happen. Because she deserved the truth dipped by the person who'd been withholding it, not discovered some other way. Not from Edwin, not from a county notice, not from some rider who recognized Harlan's horse. From him, directly, in whatever words he could find for it. It was the least he could do. It was also, he suspected, going to be one of the hardest things he'd done in 15 years of building an operation that had required him to do a fair number of hard things. He closed his eyes. Porter checked the door, found the world unchanged, and went back to sleep. He was gone before the sky turned gray. Elowen found out the same way she found out most things, by noticing what wasn't there. The sorrel was gone from the corral. The barn door was latched from the outside rather than the inside. His bedroll was folded and set on the shelf above where he slept, which was either the habit of a considerate man or the habit of one who wasn't planning to come back. And she stood in the barn doorway for a moment, trying to determine which reading she trusted more. Porter sat beside her and looked at the empty corral with what she could only describe as mild professional disappointment. "I know," she said to the dog. She went back inside and started her morning. She told herself she wasn't thinking about it. She fed the animals and checked the water levels and reset the one fence post she'd been meaning to get to all week. And she did all of it with the same practical attention she gave every task. But underneath the attention, running alongside it like a creek beside a road, was the question she wasn't going to give too much space to yet: where he'd gone, whether he was coming back, whether she'd been wrong about him in the particular way she'd been told her. Whole life she was susceptible to trusting too fast, too completely, on evidence that looked solid until it wasn't. She hadn't told him about the survey document. Not really. She'd confirmed it existed when he asked, which was different from telling him. But she hadn't examined that distinction too carefully, because at the time it had seemed unimportant. It seemed slightly more important now, with the corral empty and the barn door latched from the outside. By midday, she'd decided he was either gone for good or gone for a reason, and since she couldn't influence either outcome by worrying about it, she went back to work. He came back on the second day. She was in the side yard mending tack when she heard the gate, and she looked up without meaning to, and there was the sorrel coming up the road, with Cal Rourke on its back, looking like a man who had ridden hard and slept infrequently and had arrived at some private conclusion that was sitting uneasily in his chest. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the leather strap in her hands. "You're back," she said. "I said I would be," he said. "You didn't say anything. You left before I was up." He climbed down from the horse and stood there, holding the reins, and she could feel him looking at her face from the few yards between them. "I had something I needed to do," he said. "I didn't want to explain it before I knew if it was going to work." She set the strap across her knee. "Did it work?" A pause. "Yes." "Are you going to tell me what it was?" Another pause, longer. "Not yet," he said. "Soon." "But not yet." She looked up at him then. His face was doing something complicated. The particular expression of a man managing information he wasn't ready to deliver. And she'd known enough men in her life to recognize that expression, though she couldn't have said whether the information was good or bad or something else entirely. "Put your horse up," she said. "There's food on the stove." She went back to the strap. Behind her, she heard him lead the sorrel to the corral, heard the latch, heard his boots on the yard coming toward the house. She kept her eyes on the leather in her hands and told herself she wasn't relieved he was back, which was not entirely true, but was a position she was prepared to maintain. 2 days after his return, Edwin Price came back. He didn't arrive in the buggy this time. He arrived with a second man, Elowen, didn't recognize compact and thin, carrying a leather document case, with the specific look of someone who had been hired to look official and had taken to the assignment with some commitment. They tied their horses at the gate and came up the path with the purposeful stride of people, delivering something they expected to be refused. Elowen saw them from the kitchen window. Harlan, she still thought of him as Cal. It was the name she had. The name that fit the version of him she knew was repairing the barn hinge she'd mentioned 4 days ago. He had his back to the approaching men and hadn't noticed them yet. She went to the door before they reached the porch. "Edwin," she said. Elowen. Edwin's warmth was gone this visit. He wasn't performing cordiality anymore, which she found oddly, somewhat easier to work with. This is Mr. Aldous Webb. He's representing the interests of the parties holding your late husband's outstanding notes. Thomas didn't have outstanding notes, she said. Mr. Webb has documentation that says otherwise. Edwin gestured, and Webb opened the document case and produced a set of papers, thick and official-looking, with a county seal on the uppermost page. She took them. She looked at them, slowly and carefully, which she could tell frustrated Edwin because he'd expected either immediate collapse or immediate refusal, and careful reading was neither. The documents were better than the first set. Someone had spent real money on this version. The paper was right. The dates were internally consistent. The language was legal and specific, and had clearly been written by someone who knew what they were doing. Whoever Edwin had hired to manufacture these had done thorough work. But Thomas's handwriting wasn't on them. Thomas had signed everything. Every purchase agreement, every note, every exchange they'd ever made. She had his signature in her ledgers next to every significant financial decision going back 6 years. She knew what his signature looked like at every point in his adult life, the way it got more cramped when he was tired, the particular loop on the H in Hartwell, the slight leftward drift he'd had in his last months when his hand was unsteady. The signatures on these documents were excellent reproductions. They were not Thomas's. These are forgeries, she said. Edwin didn't even flinch. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. She looked up from the papers. You should understand that I have 6 years of Thomas's financial records in this house. Every document he actually signed. I can put these next to any of them and show you the differences. Handwriting comparisons are not a legal standard, Webb said, speaking for the first time. He had a dry, precise voice that matched the document case. A court might disagree, she said. You'd need to get to court first, Edwin said. And that requires money for legal representation, and a court date that's months out, and in the meantime the notes are technically due, which means the property reverts to the creditors while the dispute is processed. He paused, letting that sit. Or you could accept a reasonable resolution now. Marrying Harlan Voss, she said, which would satisfy all outstanding obligations and leave you secure for life, he said. Elowen, I'm trying to help you. She held the documents in her hands and thought about the survey filing in the tin box in the barn. She thought about the clean, specific language of that document, the limestone shelf, the underground origin, the coordinates of the source. She thought about Thomas sitting at this table writing it out in his careful, even hand, saying, nobody should be able to take this from us, Elle. I want it on record. She hadn't shown those papers to anyone. Not Edwin, not the lawyer in Rawlins, not the man in the barn who had asked about them directly and to whom she had told more than she'd planned to. She had kept them because Thomas had kept them, and because she understood in a general way that they were important. She had not understood until about 2 weeks ago exactly how important, and she did not intend to produce them in front of Edwin Price while Edwin Price was standing on her porch. I need time to review these documents, she said. You have until the end of the month, Webb said. That's 2 weeks, she said. That's what you have, Edwin said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who has stopped performing patience. She gave the documents back to Webb. I'll be in contact. She held the door and waited, and after a moment they went back down the path and untied their horses and left. And she watched from the doorway until they were past the gate. Behind her, from the yard, she heard boots on the dirt. She turned. Cal was standing 10 feet from the porch, and from the angle she could see, he'd had a clear line of sight to the porch the whole time without being visible from the gate. His face was doing the thing again, the managed, careful thing she'd come to associate with information he was carrying. How much of that did you hear? She said. Enough, he said. Then you know he's coming back at the end of the month, and I have 2 weeks. I know, he said. She looked at him for a moment. The April light was sharp and clear, and it caught the planes of his face in a way that made him look briefly unfamiliar. And she had the strange passing sensation she sometimes got around him of looking at someone she almost recognized from a different context. She dismissed it and went inside. That evening, she brought the tin box down from the shelf. She did it herself, didn't ask him to. Took the 3-step stool and retrieved it from its spot and brought it to the kitchen table and set it in front of her. She'd looked at these papers many times since Thomas died. She knew what they said. What she needed now was to think about what they meant in terms of the specific situation she was in. He came in from the barn and stopped when he saw the box. Sit down, she said. I want another set of eyes on this. He sat across the table from her. She opened the box and set the papers out in the order Thomas had filed them. The original survey notes in Thomas's writing, the formal filing document with the county seal, and a hand-drawn map with the source coordinates marked in red. She watched him look at them. He was very still while he read. He turned each page carefully, read it fully before going to the next. He did not rush, which she appreciated, because rushed reading meant partial understanding, and she needed him to understand all of it. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at the table. This source coordinate, he said, pointing without touching the map. That's inside your patent boundary by a significant margin. By 12 feet, according to this survey, she said. 12 feet is enough, he said. If this filing is properly recorded at the county registry, it establishes that Silver Run originates on your land. Not on common access land, not on any parceled land, yours, he looked up. Has anyone challenged this filing since Thomas submitted it? Not to my knowledge. I didn't know it was this specific until after Thomas died, and I looked through his papers. And Edwin has never mentioned it. Edwin has never mentioned it, she confirmed. Which means either he doesn't know it exists, or he knows and believes he can overwhelm it with enough legal paperwork. Harlan was quiet for a moment. The second option is more likely, he said slowly. She looked at him. Why, he shifted in his chair. The managed expression was back, and this time it had a quality to it that she couldn't quite place, not deception exactly, but the particular tension of someone who knows more than they're saying about the exact subject under discussion. Because manufactured debt documentation is expensive, he said. You don't spend that kind of money on a property without knowing what makes it worth the expense. The spring, she said. The spring, he said, which someone wanted rights to. His jaw tightened, barely perceptibly. Yes, she kept her eyes on his face. She had the feeling again, the passing recognition, the sense of looking at someone she knew from a different angle. Cal, she said. Is there something you want to tell me? The silence lasted 3 seconds. 4, 5, not yet, he said. But soon. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at the papers. I need to get this document to the county registry. Verified and publicly recorded. I know, he said. I can't leave the property for the 2-day ride it would take without leaving the livestock unattended. I know that too, he said. She waited. I can ride there, he said, if you trust me with the original documents. She looked at him for a long time. This was the question, wasn't it? This had always been the question, sitting underneath every other question since the afternoon he'd appeared at her gate in cracked boots asking for work. Did she trust him with the one thing she couldn't afford to lose? Why would you do that, she said. He looked at his hands on the table. Because it's the right thing to do. That's not a complete answer. He looked up. His eyes were direct and tired and had something in them she couldn't name precisely, but which had the quality of honesty, the particular honesty that doesn't perform itself. No, he said. It's not. But it's the truest part of the answer right now. She sat with that for a moment. All right, she said finally. She made him copies of the key documents before she gave him the originals. She wrote a letter to the county registrar, signed and dated, directing the office to verify and confirm the existing filing under Thomas Hartwell's name and to register her as current owner of record. She sealed it and gave it to him with the documents. The registrar's name is Clement Burgess, she said. He's been in that office for 12 years. He's thorough but slow. Don't let him put you off. I won't, he said. If anything goes wrong, I'll send word immediately. She stood at the porch and watched him saddle the sorrel in the early dark. The temperature had dropped, and her breath made small visible clouds in the air. Porter sat beside her and watched too. He rode out of the yard and didn't look back, which she found she needed not for sentiment but for information. A man who looks back is still calculating. A man who doesn't has already decided. She went inside. She was not going to sleep well, and she knew it, and she accepted it, the same way she accepted most things she couldn't change directly, and without much ceremony. He was gone for 3 days. She had work enough to fill them, and she did, pushing through the fence line on the east side that she'd been postponing for 2 weeks and spending the better part of a day repairing the root cellar door that had warped through the winter. Physical work was its own kind of useful. It kept the body occupied and gave the mind something to organize itself around when everything else was uncertain. On the second day, Nora Osborne came by. This was unexpected. Nora had never come to the homestead uninvited. She arrived in a light wagon with 2 covered dishes and the slightly embarrassed expression of someone doing something they've decided to do before they fully worked out why. "I made too much," Nora said, holding up the dishes. "And Tom said I should bring some over." "Tom didn't say that," Elowen said. Nora's expression shifted to something more honest. "No," she admitted, "he didn't." She held up the dishes again. "But the food is real." Elowen opened the door wider and Nora came in, and they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the kind of halting, genuine conversation that happens between women who have been near each other for years without actually talking. Nora asked about the Holt children, who were recovering. Apparently, word had come down the valley. She asked about the fence line on the east side, having heard about it from someone, and mentioned that her husband Tom owed Elowen about 6 hours of labor for the fence line dispute if she ever wanted to collect. "I might take him up on that," Elowen said. "Please do. It would be good for him." Nora wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I also heard that Edwin Price came by again." Elowen said nothing. "You don't have to tell me anything," Nora said quickly. She stopped. "The women in this valley should know when someone is being pushed. That's all. In case it's useful." Elowen looked at her across the table. She thought about the Garvey's door opening 4 inches, and Mrs. Fitch's delivered opinions, and the women at Decker's Dry Goods, who had been narrating her life from a distance for 2 years. "Edwin has manufactured debt documentation against Thomas's estate," she said. "He wants the spring." Nora was quiet. "I'm working on addressing it legally," Elowen said. "Is there anything I can do?" "Not yet," Elowen said. "But I may know in a few days." Nora nodded. She stayed another hour and helped with a task she wasn't asked to help with, which was fixing the kitchen window latch that had been sticking since January. She had practical hands, Nora Osborne, and she used them without needing to be asked, which Elowen noted and appreciated in the specific way. She appreciated things that were actually useful rather than merely well-intentioned. After Nora left, the homestead felt slightly different. Not larger exactly, less isolated, which was not something Elowen had realized she'd been feeling until it partially lifted. He came back on the 3rd evening, and he was not alone. She heard 2 horses coming up the road and went to the door and saw the sorrel, and beside it a bay horse she didn't recognize. Carrying a man she recognized immediately, and with a sinking cold clarity that rearranged everything she thought she understood about the previous 2.5 weeks. She knew Harlan Voss by sight. Everyone in the Callaway Flats Basin knew Harlan Voss by sight. His picture had been in the Rawlins paper twice in the last 3 years. Once for a land acquisition, and once for something to do with cattle association politics. She'd seen him from a distance at the Rawlins Stock Fair the autumn before Thomas died. A tall man on a very good horse, moving through a crowd of people who reorganized themselves slightly to give him room without quite noticing they were doing it. She stood in the doorway and watched both men come through the gate, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical why the drifter's eyes had never matched his boots. The man she'd been calling Cal Rourke pulled the sorrel up and looked at her from the yard. He looked at her with the full weight of everything he hadn't said for 2.5 weeks, and it sat in his face without any of the management she was used to seeing there. Just the actual thing, unfiltered. The other man, the one on the bay, was the county registrar, Clement Burgess, who she recognized because she had written him a letter. "Mrs. Hartwell," Burgess said, with the stiffness of an official performing an official function somewhere he hadn't planned to be. "I've come to inform you in person that the survey filing under your late husband's name has been verified, and your ownership of the water source, designated Silver Run, has been formally recorded. You'll receive the official documentation by post within the week, but as of 3 days ago, the record is public and permanent." She kept her eyes on the man she'd been calling Cal. He also filed a formal complaint with the county attorney regarding the fraudulent debt instruments, Burgess added. With the slight discomfort of someone who has been dragged into drama, he usually manages from a comfortable bureaucratic distance. That process is now underway. She still didn't say anything. Burgess looked between them. "I'll give you a moment." He rode his horse to the far end of the yard and became intensely interested in the middle distance. The man on the sorrel climbed down. He stood in the yard, his reins in his hand, and he looked at her with his actual face, which was, she thought, very much Harlan Voss's face, and also, at the same time, the face of someone who had eaten her beans and driven her wagon to the Holt homestead and split her wood before sunrise and folded his bedroll when he left because he'd been raised to leave a space as he'd found it. My name is Harlan Voss, he said. He said it the way she would have wanted him to say it plainly, without defense or elaboration, offering it the way you offer something you owe. She breathed in through her nose. Out. I know who you are, she said. I know you do. He didn't move, didn't try to close the distance between them. I came here in borrowed clothes because Edwin had told me you were willing to marry for money, and I wanted to know if that was true before I made any decision. And, she said, it wasn't true, he said. You knew that. I'm telling you anyway. You were testing me, she said. The words tasted exactly like what they were. Yes. For 2.5 weeks. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Out in the yard, Clement Burgess was having a very detailed examination of the fence line on the north side and was going to continue having it for as long as this took. You let me trust you, she said. You let me trust Cal Rourke, who doesn't exist. He existed, Harlan said, and something in his voice was specific and careful with that word. Everything you saw was real. I wasn't performing anything. I just wasn't telling you the name attached to it. That's a distinction I'm not sure I accept. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to accept it tonight. She stood in the doorway and felt the cold air coming from behind her, from inside the house, where the lamp on the table was throwing a yellow rectangle across the porch boards. You fixed my roof, she said. Yes. You drove me to 3 homesteads in thawing mud and kept Martin Holt occupied for 4 hours so he didn't fall apart in front of his children. Yes. And then you went to the county seat and filed the survey document and reported Edwin's manufactured debts and brought the registrar here personally. Yes. She looked at him. His face had the specific quality of a man who has prepared himself for a range of outcomes and will accept whichever one arrives, because he understands he has no standing to negotiate. You did that before you told me who you were, she said. Yes, he said. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because if I told you who I was first, you'd have had reason to wonder why I was doing it, he said. Whether it was about the land, the water, making myself look better before the confession. I wanted the thing done before the question was available. He paused. You deserve to have it done without strings. The lamp threw its yellow light across the boards. Porter came from somewhere behind her and went down the porch steps and sat in the yard and looked at the sorrel with mild interest, which in Porter terms was practically an enthusiastic welcome. She looked at the dog. She looked at the man. She looked at the registrar, examining her fence line with professional dedication. Edwin isn't finished, she said finally. Reporting the debt starts a process. He has money to fight it. I have more money, Harlan said. And lawyers who know the difference between a legitimate dispute and harassment. I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I know you're not, he said. I'm telling you that Edwin Price committed fraud on your property and used me as an unwitting instrument of it. That's also my problem. That's not charity. She considered this. It was, she thought, a fair point. Annoyingly fair. You can't stay here, she said. Not tonight. Not as she gestured at him, meaning as yourself, as the person I didn't know you were, with all of that between us. I understand, he said. I need time to think. Take whatever time you need. I may decide this is unforgivable, she said. She said it directly, because she didn't know yet whether it was, and he deserved to know she didn't know. I know, he said. That's your right. She looked at him for a long moment in the lamp-lit dark. The survey is recorded, she said. Permanently, he said. Nobody can touch Silver Run. She nodded once. She looked at Burgess, who was practically excavating the fence post with his eyes at this point. Thank you, Mr. Burgess, she called, for making the trip. Burgess turned with a relief that was probably unprofessional. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. Official documents by post within the week. I appreciate it, she said. She looked at Harlan Voss one more time. He was standing in her yard in real clothes on a real horse, and he looked like what he was, a man with money and land, and a reputation and a decision he'd made that had cost him something, and who was standing in the consequences of it without trying to minimize them. She didn't say anything else. She went inside and closed the door and stood in her kitchen in the yellow lamplight and pressed both palms flat on the table, the same way she had after he'd gone to the county seat, as if the table's solidity was something she needed to confirm. Outside, she heard him ride away. She stood there for a while. Then she went to the stove and checked the fire and put the kettle on, because the kettle was something she could manage, and right now she needed at least one thing she could manage. And she stood in her kitchen in the house on the land that now legally owned the water that ran beneath it. And she thought about the next 2 weeks in the legal process against Edwin, and the fence posts still waiting in the south field, and the fact that somewhere between here and Callaway Flats, a man named Harlan Voss was riding away from her gate in the dark and waiting to find out if she was going to let him come back. She didn't know the answer yet. She put her hands around the warming kettle and thought about a man who had fixed her roof and driven her wagon and folded his bedroll when he left. And she thought about whether those things were still true if the name attached to them was different than the one she'd been given. She thought about it for a long time. The kettle began to steam. The kettle went cold before she touched it. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after she heard the horses leave both of them, the bay and the sorrel moving away from the gate together, their hoofbeats fading into the particular silence that Wyoming nights specialized in, the kind that didn't fill up with anything once it arrived. Porter came back inside and went to his spot by the stove and turned 2 circles and lay down with his chin on his paws, watching her in the way he watched things he was concerned about, but had no useful intervention for. She finally picked up the kettle and poured herself a cup and sat at the table. The official documents from Clement Burgess were somewhere in Harlan Voss's coat pocket, she supposed, or his saddlebag. She would receive copies by post within the week, Burgess had said. Her name, her water, permanent record. She should have felt relieved. She felt something, but relief was only part of it, and not the loudest part. The loudest part was the anger, which was clean and specific, and didn't need much examination to understand. He had looked her in the face for 2.5 weeks, and answered to a name that wasn't his. She had told that name things she didn't tell people easily. She had driven that name to 3 homesteads in thawing mud. She had sat across that name at her kitchen table, and let it ask about the survey document, and answered more honestly than she'd intended to, because something about the way he asked had felt trustworthy, and that trustworthiness had been real, and also constructed simultaneously, which was the part she kept returning to. Both things at once. That was what made it difficult. She drank her cold tea, and listened to the dark, and eventually went to bed, and she slept badly, and in the morning she got up and went to work, because that was what there was to do. The next 10 days were their own particular kind of ordeal. Edwin Price did not come back in person, but his lawyer sent 2 letters, both of which she read carefully and set aside without responding. The formal complaint Harlan had filed with the county attorney was apparently moving faster than Edwin had anticipated. She heard this through Nora Osborne, who had a sister in Rawlins with a husband in law practice, and the sister had mentioned that certain parties were finding the county attorney unexpectedly motivated. Money had a way of moving legal processes, and Harlan Voss, it appeared, had engaged representation that Edwin's resources were finding difficult to outpace. She didn't know how she felt about that either. She was sitting on the fence rail, watching 2 of her mares in the near pasture, when Nora's wagon came up the road on the 5th day after the revelation in the doorway. Nora had taken to stopping by twice a week now, sometimes with food, sometimes with information, always with the particular directness that Elowen had decided she'd undervalued in her neighbors across the board. He came to the Rawlins Stock Association meeting, Nora said, before she'd fully set the brake. Elowen looked at her. Who did? Harlan Voss. Nora climbed down with the efficiency of someone who'd been getting in and out of wagons for 40 years. Tom went yesterday. He said Voss stood up in front of the whole room and told them that Edwin Prices had used the association's records to misrepresent water access rights in the Callaway Flats Basin, and that any rancher who'd made arrangements based on those representations should speak to a lawyer. Elowen was quiet. Tom said the room went very still, Nora said. And then it went very loud. How many ranchers had Edwin made arrangements with? Elowen said. Apparently more than anyone knew. He'd been selling access promises on Silver Run to 4 different operations, promising them water he didn't own to agreements that depended on a marriage that hadn't happened. Nora stopped at the fence and leaned her arms on the top rail. He built a whole structure on something he didn't have, and now the structure is coming down. Elowen looked at the mares in the pasture. The larger one, Cassidy, was doing her habitual thing of standing in the exact center of the field for no apparent reason, staring at the middle distance with enormous equine dignity. He didn't have to do that, she said. The county attorney process would have addressed the fraud. Slower, Nora said, and quieter. This way every rancher in 2 counties knows what Edwin did. He won't be able to operate here again. Elowen thought about a man standing up in a room full of people whose money and respect he'd built his reputation among, and publicly dismantling the arrangement he'd entered into with one of them. It was not a comfortable thing to do. She knew enough about how those rooms worked to know it would cost him something in the short-term questions about his own judgment, about why he'd engaged with Edwin in the first place, about what he'd been thinking. He'd done it anyway. She was still angry, but the anger was developing texture now, getting complicated in ways she hadn't invited. He wrote her a letter. It arrived on the 7th day in an envelope with no return address, but handwriting she recognized immediately because she'd watched that hand move across pages when he thought she wasn't looking. She held the envelope for a while before opening it. It was 2 pages. The letter was 2 pages. He didn't waste the first page on apologies, which she would have resented, because apologies at the front of a letter are a way of making the letter about the writer's feelings rather than the reader's. He started with the practical. He had filed the formal complaint. He had engaged a Rawlins lawyer, a good one, he said, named Albright, who had handled 3 similar fraud cases in the past 5 years. Albright believed the manufactured debt documents would be proven fraudulent within 60 days. Edwin's own lawyer had already begun distancing himself from 2 of the more obvious forgeries. The water rights were recorded. The recording was public and permanent, and had been reviewed by 2 independent surveyors Albright had hired to confirm the source coordinates. Both had confirmed Thomas's original survey was accurate. Silver Run belonged to her. It had always belonged to her. It was simply now inarguable in ways it hadn't been before. The second page was different. He didn't apologize for the disguise exactly. What he wrote was this. He had come to her gate in borrowed clothes because he'd been told she was willing to trade herself for security, and he'd wanted to see whether that was true. It wasn't. He'd known it wasn't within 3 days, and he'd stayed anyway, which was a different problem with a different cause. And that cause was something he wasn't going to write in a letter because it deserved to be said in person if she was willing to hear it. He wasn't asking her to forgive the deception. He wasn't sure forgiveness was the right frame for it. What he was asking, if she was willing, was whether she would consider speaking with him again. Not to settle anything, not to agree to anything, just to speak, as people who had actually spent 2.5 weeks in close enough proximity that she knew how he took his coffee, and he knew which mare she worried about when the temperature dropped. At the bottom of the page, he wrote, "I fixed your fence posts wrong on the east side. The 3rd and 7th from the north gate need to be reset at a different angle, or they'll heave again next winter. I should have caught it when I did them. I'm sorry about that, specifically." She read that last paragraph 3 times. She folded the letter and put it in her kitchen drawer, and went back outside and looked at the east fence line. The 3rd and 7th posts from the north gate were, as stated, at a slightly off angle that what problems in the freeze-thaw cycle. She'd noticed it herself, but hadn't gotten to it. She stood in the afternoon light and looked at those posts, and felt something move through her chest that was neither anger nor its absence, but something more specific and considerably more inconvenient. She did not write back immediately. She spent 3 more days with the letter in the drawer going about her work, thinking about it in the background, the way you think about something you haven't decided yet. She turned it over from different angles. She looked at the 2 weeks she'd spent with Cal Rourke and tried to separate what had been real from what had been constructed, and she kept running into the same problem. She couldn't find the seam. The practical competence was real. The way he'd listened was real. The night they'd driven back from the Osborns in the dark, with her hands shaking from exhaustion, and he'd made supper without being asked and set it in front of her and didn't say anything about it that was real. The fence posts done wrong on the east side because he'd been distracted by something he wasn't telling her that was real too, in a different way. You couldn't fake badly set fence posts. Or rather you could, but only a real person would admit to them in a letter. On the 10th day she wrote back. She kept it short. She said she'd read his letter. She said the east fence posts were confirmed. She'd had a look. She said she had no interest in having a conversation about whether she ought to forgive him, because that framing put her in the position of granting or withholding something, and she didn't want that position. She wanted an actual conversation between 2 people who had apparently discovered they could talk to each other with some honesty even under unusual circumstances. She said she would be at the homestead on Saturday afternoon if he wanted to come. She sent it before she could reconsider, which was a technique she'd used before, on decisions she knew were right, but which made her nervous. He came on Saturday. He did not come in fine clothes. He did not ride his best horse or bring anything that announced itself. He came in the kind of clean but plain clothes a man wears when he's trying to show up as himself rather than as his circumstances. And he rode the sorrel, which she'd half expected, and he tied it at the gate rather than assuming he'd be welcomed far enough in to use the corral. She saw him from the window and took a moment before going to the door. Porter was already at the door, tail doing a single slow wag, which was Porter's version of enthusiasm. She opened the door. He was standing at the edge of the porch, hat in hand, which she noted. Not from performance he'd had his hat in his hand at Martin Holt's cabin, too. She remembered when Martin was frightened and needed someone to talk to. It was a habit of attention, the physical acknowledgement that you were in someone else's space. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for asking," he said. She stepped back and he came in, and she put coffee on because it was the first concrete thing available to do, and he sat at the table where he'd sat before, in the chair that had become his chair over 2 weeks, which she noticed, and which she suspected he noticed her noticing. They were quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet, which surprised her slightly. "I want to ask you something," she said, setting the cups down. "All right," he said. "When did you know that you weren't going to go through with Edwin's plan?" He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Third day," he said. "Maybe the end of the second." She looked at him. "That's early." "You gave me better food than you ate yourself the first morning," he said. "Before you knew anything about me. Because I was a stranger, and you had a portion you could share." He looked at the table. "I've met a lot of people over a lot of years. And that specific thing, the automatic, unconsidered kind of generous, I've never seen it manufactured. You can't practice it. Either it's how you move through the world or it isn't." She was quiet. "I stayed because I didn't know what to do about Edwin yet," he said. "And then I stayed because he started again, because I didn't want to leave." "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying to be," he said. She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside, the afternoon light was doing its particular Wyoming thing, going golden and low and making ordinary objects, the fence posts, the water trough, the worn boards of the porch, look briefly significant. "You lost something," she said, going public about Edwin in front of the Stock Association. "People will question why you got involved with him in the first place." "Yes," he said. "Does that bother you?" He considered it honestly, which she appreciated. "Some," he said. "I made a poor judgment engaging with him at all. I should have looked harder at how he'd acquired the leverage he claimed to have. I didn't because it was convenient not to." He paused. "I'm not used to being the person who didn't look hard enough. I don't enjoy the experience. But you did it anyway, went public, because it was true and it needed to be said." She set her cup down. "I'm still angry with you," she said. "I know. Not because you're wealthy. I want to be clear about that. I don't care what you own." "I know that too," he said. "Because you let me trust you under false pretenses," she said. "And I don't give trust easily. I gave it to you, to who I thought you were, and now I have to figure out whether that trust belongs to the person I was talking to or the name I wasn't given. And I don't know how to separate those." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't think they are separate." "Explain that." He looked at his hands around the cup. "I've spent 15 years being Harlan Voss in rooms full of people who wanted something from me. I got very good at being what those situations required. I didn't lie, exactly, but I performed. Versions of myself, depending on the room." He paused. "I came here in borrowed boots, and I had nothing to perform because I had nothing to offer. I was just in your yard, doing the work. And that person, that version without the performance, I think that's the most accurate thing I've been in a long time." He looked up, which doesn't excuse the name, but it's why I think the trust wasn't misplaced in the way it might seem. She sat with that for a while. "You're asking me to consider that Cal Rourke was more real than Harlan Voss," she said. "I'm saying they're the same person," he said. "I'm saying the coat and the boots didn't change who I was underneath them. Only what you knew about me. What I knew about you," she said, "was a lie. What you knew about me was incomplete," he said. "I know that's a distinction you may not accept, but I want to be accurate about what I did, because I don't want to make it sound smaller than it was. And I also don't want to make it sound different than it was." She looked at him across the table. His face was doing none of the managed thing now. It was just his face tired around the eyes, honest in the set of his jaw, looking at her without the particular practiced composure she'd seen on Harlan Voss's face in the newspaper picture, and recognizing now as the face he wore in rooms where he was performing. This was not that. "I need more time," she said. Take it, he said. Immediately. No hesitation. I'm not saying it's unforgivable, she said. I said I might decide that. I haven't decided. I understand, and I'm not. She stopped. Looked at her cup. I'm not unaware that what you did at the county seat and at the stock association were real things that cost you something real. I'm keeping account of that. I just also need to keep account of the other thing. That's fair, he said. Both things can be true, she said, half to herself. Yes, he said, they usually are. She almost smiled. It was a small and involuntary thing, and she stopped it quickly, but she saw him see it, and she saw him decide not to make anything of it, which was the right decision, and she noted that too. They talked for another hour. Not about the situation or Edwin or water rights or deception. He asked about the East pasture and whether she was planning to expand the herd this season. And she asked about the stock association and what it was like managing the scale of operation he ran. And they talked about horses for a while because it turned out they both had opinions about horses, and most of the opinions were compatible with some interesting disagreements in the margins. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat and held it and looked at her. Can I come back, he said, not to negotiate anything. He gestured slightly, meaning this talking. This ordinary afternoon in a kitchen with coffee and horses discussed, and both things at once held without resolution. She thought about it. She was aware of thinking about it in front of him, which was intentional. She didn't want to hide the deliberation. Yes, she said, but not every week. I'll write when I'm ready for the next visit. That's fine, he said. And you come the way you came today, she said. Not the other way. Not with anything that needs explaining or managing or that makes the visit into something it isn't. He looked at her steadily. Just me, he said. Just you, she said. Whoever that turns out to be. He went to the door and she held it, and he went down the porch steps and untied the sorrel and got on. He looked back once, at the gate, which she'd been curious about since the last time. Then he rode out, and the sound of the sorrel on the road gradually became the sound of nothing in particular. And she stood in the doorway with the warm air from the kitchen against her back. Porter pushed his nose against her hand. I know, she said to the dog. The legal process moved through April and into May. Edwin Price's lawyer withdrew formally from 2 of the 3 debt documents in the 3rd week of April, which the county attorney apparently interpreted as the professional equivalent of a confession. Edwin himself sent one more letter, not to Elowen, but to Harlan, through formal channels, threatening a countersuit for defamation. Albright, Harlan's lawyer, wrote back a response that Nora Osborne described as the kind of letter that makes lawyers nervous about their own side. The countersuit threat evaporated. In early May, the county attorney issued a formal finding that the debt instruments submitted against the Hartwell estate were fraudulent documents and constituted attempted property fraud under Wyoming statutes. Edwin Price was given the option of a public hearing or a formal settlement. He chose the settlement, which required him to withdraw all claims, pay Elowen's legal costs, and accept a formal bar from filing instruments against the Hartwell property for 25 years. The document arrived by post on a Tuesday. Elowen read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee and then set it in the tin box with Thomas's survey papers because it belonged there. She wrote Harlan a short note that said, "It's done. The box is full." "Thank you for Albright," he wrote back. "I'm glad. And I fixed the fence posts on the east side, if you'll let me. The 7th one especially. It won't wait another winter." She read that 3 times, too. She wrote back Saturday. He came on Saturday, and they fixed the east fence together, which was not how she'd imagined the day going when she'd written the note, but which was, she found, exactly the right thing. Physical work had its own logic between people. It gave you something to do with your hands while you said the things that needed hands, and it gave you something to look at when looking at each other was too direct. He was better with the post setter, now that he wasn't pretending to be a man who'd done it before. "You knew how to do this the whole time," she said. "I knew the principle," he said. "I'd supervised it. I hadn't actually driven a lot of posts myself." "I could tell," she said. "And you didn't say anything. I figured you'd get better," she said. "And you did." He looked at her sideways, in the afternoon light with the post setter in his hands, and Wyoming spread out behind him in all its flat, unreasonable beauty. "That's a specific kind of patience," he said. "I'm a specific kind of person," she said. They set the last post and tamped it and stood back and looked at the line. It was better. Not perfect, the 3rd post was still slightly low, which she'd noticed and which he apparently hadn't, but it would hold, and close enough to write was often the best available outcome. I want to tell you something, he said, not looking at her, looking at the fence. All right, she said. When I was listening to you in the cottonwood grove, he stopped. I wasn't doing it on purpose. I'd pulled up the horses on the road, and I could hear your voice. I know, she said. I'd have been angrier if I thought it was deliberate. You said you trusted the drifter in your barn more than Harlan Voss. He was quiet for a moment. I've thought about that a lot. I meant it, she said. At the time I meant it. Do you still? She looked at the fence line. Then she looked at him. He was watching her with the honest waiting expression that she'd seen on his face hasten her kitchen doorway, the cook's doorway, the one that offered nothing and expected nothing, and was just there, available if she wanted to say the true thing. I think, she said carefully, that I was talking about the same person in both halves of that sentence. I just didn't know it yet. He was very still. Which doesn't mean I'm not still angry, she said. I know, or that it's resolved. I know that too. But it means I'm not, she looked for the right word. I'm not treating them as two different men anymore. That's all I'm saying. He looked at the fence post between them. She looked at it too. The prairie wind came through and moved the grass in the far pasture, and Cassidy, the large mare, was standing in the exact center of the field, doing her usual thing of existing with enormous self-satisfied dignity. I'd like to keep coming on Saturdays, he said. If you'll keep writing. I'll keep writing if you stop fixing things wrong, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I'll fix the third post before I leave. See that you do, she said. She handed him the post setter and went back to the house to start supper, and she was aware, walking across the yard, of the specific weight of the afternoon, not comfortable exactly, not resolved, not the clean ending of anything, just real. Two people with real problems and a real mess between them, and a real afternoon, and a fence that needed work, and a mare standing in a pasture, and the specific honest difficulty of choosing to keep going. When you didn't know yet how it was going to come out. She put water on the stove. Outside, she could hear the post setter working. The regular, deliberate sound of it, patient and specific, doing the job right this time. She stood at the stove and listened to it, and didn't think about what she was feeling, because she didn't need to think about it right now. She just let it be there, whatever it was, real and complicated and unresolved and hers. The water started to warm. The Saturdays became a kind of structure. Not every week she'd said that clearly, and she meant it, and he respected it in the way that mattered, which was by not pushing on the edges of it. Some weeks she wrote, and some weeks she didn't, and when she didn't, he waited, and when she did, he came, and gradually through May and into the early heat of June, they built something that didn't have a name yet, but had a shape. Work, mostly. He'd developed the habit of arriving, with his sleeves already rolled up, which she appreciated, because it meant they could get straight to whatever the homestead needed without the preliminary of him standing around waiting to be assigned. He was not, she discovered, as competent at everything as he'd initially appeared. He could set a fence post correctly now, when he concentrated, but he had a persistent problem with wire splicing that produced joins that held under moderate pressure and failed under serious stress. She showed him twice. He improved. He didn't get defensive about being shown, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience with men who were used to being the most capable person in most rooms. You're gripping too tight, she told him. The third time he produced a splice that looked right and wasn't. The wire needs to move while you're working it, not be held still. I know that now, he said, looking at his work with the expression of a man who finds being bad at things genuinely irritating. You knew it before too, she said. Knowing it and doing it are different. He glanced up at her. Is that about the wire? It's about the wire, she said, and handed him the pliers back. But he heard both answers, and she knew he did, and that was enough for now. June brought a dry stretch that nobody was happy about. The creek on the Osborne's south end dropped to a trickle by the third week, and the Garvey cattle were ranging wider looking for water, which was how Mrs. Garvey, who had opened her door 4 inches in March and graduated to opening it fully, by May ended up at Elowen's gate on a Wednesday afternoon, looking like a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say and then lost the rehearsal somewhere on the road over. The creek's down, Mrs. Garvey said from the gate. She hadn't come up the path. Old habits. I know it, Elowen said from the porch. Gerald's asking about the animals. A pause. Gerald was the 7-year-old who'd had the headache. He and Mrs. Garvey had apparently not forgiven each other for the fever scare in different ways that were nonetheless both real. He wants to know if the cattle are going to be all right. What do you want to know? Elowen said. Mrs. Garvey looked at the gatepost. Same thing, I suppose. Elowen looked at her for a moment. Come up, she said. Mrs. Garvey came up, and they stood in the yard and talked about the creek and the grass and the particular way this dry stretch felt different from ordinary June dry, heavier somehow, more settled in. Elowen had been watching Silver Run for 2 weeks. It hadn't dropped. The limestone shelf that fed it ran deep. Thomas had always said connected to something that didn't depend on surface rainfall for its level. How long can it stay like this before it gets serious, Mrs. Garvey said, meaning the whole valley. Depends on whether it breaks in July, Elowen said. If it doesn't break in July, serious starts in August. Mrs. Garvey nodded slowly. She looked at the north corner of the property, where the spring ran. She didn't say anything about it. To her credit, she didn't say anything about it, and she also didn't pretend she hadn't looked. I'd best get back, she said. Tell Gerald the cattle will be looked after, Elowen said. It was a promise she hadn't fully worked out the terms of yet. But 7-year-olds worried about animals deserved something concrete. Mrs. Garvey nodded once and went back down the path, and Elowen stood in the yard after she'd gone and looked at the north corner of her property and thought about what Thomas had said once, early, when they'd first arrived and understood what they had. Water in dry country isn't just water, El. It's an argument about who gets to stay. She thought about that for a while. Harlan came the following Saturday, and she told him about Mrs. Garvey. They were in the barn by then, checking the tack she'd been putting off re-oiling, and he listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to count on from him, the actual listening, not the waiting-to-talk version that most people offered. What are you thinking? He said, when she finished. I'm thinking the dry stretch isn't going to break in July, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He'd had people checking weather patterns across 2 counties. She knew it was the kind of thing a man with his operation needed to track, and she'd asked him once to share what he heard, which he'd done without making it into anything more than information. Probably not, he said, and Silver Run isn't going to drop. No, he said, not this season, not off this kind of spell. She rubbed oil into a leather strap and didn't look at him. I'm thinking about opening the gates, she said. The north corner. Letting the valley bring their livestock to the spring. He was still. Without charging for it, she said, because she wanted that part said clearly. He picked up a bridle and turned it in his hands. That's a significant decision, he said. I know what it is. You'd be managing traffic through the north corner. Potential damage to the ground around the source. People's cattle don't always respect boundaries. I know all of that, she said, and you'd be giving up the ability to charge, which at your current financial position is mine's. Harlan, she said. He stopped. I know what I'd be giving up, she said. I'm asking what you think, not whether you can talk me out of it. He set the bridle down.
He looked at her with the direct, honest look that she decided was the most reliable thing about him.
The one that didn't calculate before it arrived. I think Thomas would have done the same thing, he said. She didn't say anything. And I think you already know what you're going to do, he said. You're just telling me because you want someone to know before you do it. She looked at the strap in her hands. There's going to be talk, she said. People will say I should have charged, that I had the right and I threw it away. Some of the same people who'll bring their cattle through that gate. Probably, he said, and I'll have to listen to it. Yes, he said. You will. She set the strap aside and looked at him. You're not going to tell me it's the noble thing to do or the right thing to do or any of that. No, he said. You didn't ask me for a verdict. You asked what I think. He paused. I think it's what you are, not what you're choosing. It's just what you are. And I've known that since the first morning. She sat with that for a moment. It was not comfortable, being understood that specifically. It had its own particular weight. I'd like your help managing the north corner, she said, when it starts. I'll be here, he said, simply, without drama the way he said things now that he'd stopped managing his presentation for her benefit. I'm not asking you to do it for free, she said. Your time has value. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite amusement, but occupied the same neighborhood. Elowen, he said. Don't, she almost smiled. All right, she said. She opened the gates on the 1st of August. She did it without announcement, which was its own kind of announcement in a valley, where information traveled faster than weather. She simply rode out to the north corner fence early on a Tuesday morning and opened the gate and left it open. And by that afternoon, the first cattle from the Osborne property were drinking at Silver Run. By the end of the week, There were livestock from 6 properties coming through. By the second week of August, there were 11. Harlan came every day during that period, not just Saturdays. He was there before she asked at the gate, managing the flow, keeping competing herds from overlapping in ways that caused the particular kind of chaos that happens when cattle from different operations suddenly share a water source. He had a competence with large-scale cattle management that made her own solid knowledge look modest by comparison, and she let him use it without ceremony because the animals didn't care who was managing them, as long as someone was. Martin Holt came through on the 3rd day with a small herd and stopped to talk. "I heard what you're doing," Martin said. He had both hands on his saddle horn and was looking at her with the expression of a man trying to figure out how to say something that feels too large for ordinary words. Most people in your position wouldn't. "I'm not most people," she said. "No," he said. "You're not." He paused. "My kids are healthy. Both of them. My wife, too. I want you to know I haven't forgotten how that happened." She looked at his cattle moving toward the spring. "Take what you need, Martin," she said. "That's all." The Garveys came through the 5th day. Mrs. Garvey rode alongside her husband, and Gerald, who was on his own horse now at 7, with the confidence of a child who'd been told he was ready and believed it, and she stopped when she drew level with Elowen at the gate. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I owe you more than water." "You don't owe me anything," Elowen said. "I said things. About you. In town when you first came." Mrs. Garvey's voice had the particular flatness of a woman making herself say something she'd rather not. "Before I knew you. I said things that weren't fair." "I know you did," Elowen said. "And I know you've changed your mind. That's not it should be said is all. Some things need to be said." Elowen looked at her. "All right," she said. "It's said. Now take your cattle through." Gerald was watching this whole exchange with the enormous solemn attention of a 7-year-old at an adult conversation, storing it away with the particular efficiency of children who are always watching and rarely credited for it. He looked at Elowen. "Thank you for my animals," he said very formally. She looked at him. "You're welcome," she said equally formally. He nodded once, satisfied, and rode through the gate with his parents, and she watched the 3 of them go and felt something in her chest that was not nothing and did not need a name. Harlan was at the gate when the last property came through the Delacroix family, who ran a small operation on the eastern edge of the basin, and who Elowen had never properly met. Albert Delacroix was an older man with a bad hip who managed his place with his adult daughter Simone, and they brought 14 head through in the late afternoon, when the light was already going golden. When the cattle were through and settled at the spring, Albert Delacroix climbed down from his horse and came to Elowen and held out his hand. She shook it. He held on for an extra second. "My wife's buried on this property," he said, "on the rise past the east fence. We came here 30 years ago, and she died in the second winter, and I stayed because leaving her behind wasn't something I could do." He looked at the spring. "When I thought we'd lose the water this season, I thought I'd have to leave anyway. That 30 years of staying would just end." He let her hand go. "I'm grateful to you." She didn't have a short answer for that. She looked at the spring, at the water running easy and clear in the August heat, at the cattle, drinking without ceremony, beside the limestone shelf that Thomas had surveyed, and she had defended, and neither of them had fully understood they were defending for everyone. "I'm glad you're staying," she said. That was all she had, but it was true. Late that evening, when the last animal had gone home, and the north corner was quiet again, she and Harlan sat on the fence rail at the edge of the spring field. The air had cooled. The stars were coming on one at a time, the way they did in Wyoming, unhurried, not needing to announce themselves. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. She looked at the water. "About what I want. Which I haven't let myself think about clearly in a long time, because there were more urgent things to think about." He was quiet. He'd gotten better at that, at not filling her pauses with his own words. "I want the homestead to stay mine," she said. "Not managed by anyone else, not absorbed into a larger operation, mine. My name on the deed, my decisions about what happens here." "Yes," he said. "That was all. I want the spring to keep doing what it's doing," she said, "which is being available to people who need it, not as a business, just as water." "All right," he said, and I want she stopped. Looked at the stars coming in. "I want someone to drive the wagon when my hands are shaking from concentrating too long. And to tell me when I've set a fence post wrong, even if I'm going to tell them they should have caught it earlier." She paused. "And to be honest with me, even when it's inconvenient, especially then." He looked at her. She could see his face in the edge of the moonlight, the real face, the one without the management. I can do those things, he said. I know you can, she said. That's not the question. What's the question? Whether you want to, she said. Not as an arrangement. Not because it makes sense, financially or strategically, or because the water situation resolves conveniently. Because you want to be here. With me. On these specific terms. He was quiet long enough that she knew he was actually thinking about it, not reaching for the ready answer. She valued that more than speed. I've been on 40,000 acres, he said finally, and I've been in rooms with every kind of person that business and money bring into a room, and I've managed all of it, and he paused. I've been competent. For 15 years I've been competent and careful, and I've built what I set out to build. And I came here in a patched coat to test a woman's character, and I spent 2 weeks discovering that I was the one who needed testing. He looked at the spring. I want to be here, he said. Not because it resolves conveniently. Because I haven't been this honest since I was young enough not to know there was any other way to be, and I don't want to stop. She sat with that. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I'll have opinions about everything, and I'll be right about most of them, and I'll be wrong about some of them, and I won't always know which is which. I know, he said, and I'll still be angry sometimes about what you did. I know that too. And I need you to understand that the spring and the homestead and the deed, those don't change. They're not negotiable, even in the context of whatever this is. I know, he said. I wouldn't want them to. They're who you are. He paused. I fell in love with who you are. The property comes with it. That's just geography. She looked at him. He'd said it plainly, without theater, the way he said things now that mattered. It landed in her chest and stayed there. I fell in love with who you are too, she said. Both of you. Whichever one that is. He made a sound that was rough at the edges, not quite what he'd planned, which she found more convincing than anything smooth would have been. Both of us is the same person, he said. I know, she said. I figured that out in May. You could have told me in May. I wasn't ready in May, she said. And now? She looked at the spring, at the water running over the limestone shelf in the dark, at the moonlight on it, at the place Thomas had surveyed and she had kept, and the valley had come to in its need and found available. She thought about Mrs. Garvey's door opening 4 inches, and Martin Holt's red eyes at the wagon, and Gerald's formal thank you, and Albert Delacroix's 30 years of staying. She thought about a man in cracked boots setting a fence post wrong on the east side and admitting it in a letter, specifically. Now I'm ready, she said. They married the following spring. Not in the town of Callaway Flats, not in a church, not in any setting that required performance or audience. They married beside Silver Run, at the head of the spring where the water came up through the limestone shelf, with Nora and Tom Osborne as witnesses and Porter sitting in a proprietary way slightly to the left of the proceedings as if he'd arranged the whole thing. The deed to the homestead stayed in Elowen's name. Her decision. Harlan's land stayed in his. Their agreement, made at a kitchen table over coffee without a lawyer present, was simple. They would help each other with what they each had, and neither would swallow the other's life into their own. Some days they worked his operation. Most days they worked hers. On the days it was unclear whose problem was whose, they worked it together and didn't worry about the accounting. It was not a smooth arrangement. There were weeks when the distance between properties, a 2-hour ride, was a genuine logistical problem, and neither of them had a good solution. There were arguments about cattle management that lasted 2 days and resolved into a compromise that satisfied neither of them fully, but that both of them could live with. There were mornings when she woke up and was still angry, not about anything current, just about the 2.5 weeks. And she let herself be angry because she'd decided that was allowed, and he'd agreed that it was, and somehow that permission made the anger less sticky than it would have been otherwise. Harlan hired a good foreman for his operation, a capable woman named Ruth Sayers, who had been managing half the work already, and who, upon being given the title and the corresponding wage, proceeded to run things better than Harlan had in 3 specific areas he tried not to think about too much. He spent more of his time at the homestead, which was where he wanted to be, which was something he'd had to work up to admitting to himself because it felt like reducing himself. And eventually he understood that it wasn't reducing. It was just being somewhere that was better than most of the alternatives. Elowen expanded the herd modestly, in the careful way she expanded anything, testing first and committing second. She hired a young woman from town, daughter of the Decker family, who turned out to have a talent for horses that Elowen had suspected from the way the girl watched the animals at the fair. Her name was Clara, and she was 17 and not especially impressed by anything, which Elowen found useful. Silver Run kept running. The summer after the dry year broke in late June, a good rain, and the valley's creeks came back up, and the Garveys and Osborne's cattle no longer needed to come through the north gate. But the gate stayed open anyway, partly from habit, partly because closing it felt like a statement Elowen didn't want to make. Mrs. Garvey brought a pie in September, which was not something anyone would have predicted from the woman who had opened her door 4 inches in March 2 years prior. She set it on the porch table and said, "I made too much," which was the same thing Nora had said, which was apparently the social convention in this valley, for bringing someone something without wanting to discuss it at length. "You keep making too much," Elowen said. "I'll keep not turning it away." "That seems workable," Mrs. Garvey said, and went home. Years later, when people in the Callaway Flats Basin talked about Silver Run, they talked about it the way people talk about things that have become part of the landscape of their understanding, as if it had always meant what it meant, as if the meaning had been there from the beginning, and not made by a specific set of decisions under specific kinds of pressure. They talked about the widow who'd held on to the spring against manufactured debts and legal threats. They talked about the dry year and the open gate. They talked about the cattle baron who'd shown up in patched clothes, though the details had gotten colorful in the retelling, the way stories do when they pass through enough hands. What they didn't talk about much, because it was the kind of thing that resists being made into a story, was the particular truth at the center of it, which was this. Harlan Voss had come to Elowen Hartwell's gate with a test in his pocket, and a judgment already half formed, the way people carry judgments they haven't admitted to yet. He was going to determine whether she was worthy of the life he could offer her. He was going to look at her carefully and decide. And what he'd found, in 2.5 weeks of fence posts and wagon rides and cold beans and fever medicine and cottonwood groves, and a woman who gave her better portion to a stranger without thinking about it, was not information about her worthiness. He'd found information about his own. That's the thing nobody tells you about testing people. The test doesn't only run in one direction. Every standard you hold someone else to is a standard you've announced for yourself. Every quality you look for in another person is a quality you're claiming to value. And if you find it, if you actually find the thing you said you were looking for, you have to ask yourself whether you've been living up to your own requirements. He hadn't been. Not fully. He'd been competent and careful and successful, and he'd surrounded himself with people who needed things from him, which was a comfortable way to live because needing and being needed keeps you from having to look at the other person as someone separate from the transaction. Elowen Hartwell had looked at a penniless drifter and given him food and work and trust, not because she needed something from him, but because that was how she moved through the world. And he'd had to become someone worth that before he could have it. Not by acquiring anything, or demonstrating anything, or proving anything in any dramatic or conclusive way. Just by showing up. On Saturdays and then other days too. With his sleeves rolled up, getting the wire splice wrong, admitting to the fence posts in a letter, standing in the Stock Association room in Rawlins, and saying the true thing even when it cost him. Small things. Repeated things. The kind that don't look like becoming anything when you're in the middle of them, but that add up, over months and seasons, into something that can be tested by hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary difficulties of two people trying to build something together without losing what each of them already had. There's a question underneath every story like this one, the question people don't always ask because the answer is harder than the story. It isn't, can a person change? That one's easy. People change all the time in both directions, and circumstances push them and they push back, and the result is unpredictable and usually incomplete. The harder question is, what does it cost to become the version of yourself that was there all along but buried under the habits of advantage and the convenience of never being tested by someone who has nothing to offer you? Harlan Voss had spent 15 years being the most capable person in most rooms, and it had been genuinely earned, and it had also kept him from finding out what he was like when he was just a man with nothing to offer, standing at someone else's gate. He found out in Elowen's yard. And what he found wasn't as bad as he'd feared, but it was also not as good as he'd told himself. It was just human, ordinary, capable of deception and also capable of honesty, frightened of being seen clearly, and also, it turned out, desperate for it. That's what the borrowed boots had actually cost him, the comfortable certainty that he already knew what he was. And what the whole long, difficult, imperfectly resolved year had given him the Saturday visits and the bad wire splices, and the open gate in August and the spring wedding beside the limestone shelf was the chance to find out for real. Elowen had known who she was for a long time. She'd had to. When you have nothing to hide behind, you learn your own outline early. What she'd been looking for, without knowing she was looking, was someone who knew his, or was willing to find out. The gate at the north corner of the Hartwell homestead stayed open for a long time after the dry year passed. And Silver Run kept running, cold and clean and dependable, through every season that came after, the way good water does when it rises from something deep enough to outlast the weather on the surface. It had always been hers. It had always been theirs. In the way that things become everyone's when the person who holds them is the kind of person who knows that holding is not the same as keeping, and keeping is not the same as sharing, and sharing the unconsidered, automatic kind is not a strategy or a sacrifice. It's just what some people are, and it was in the end exactly enough.